Hubbard. The name exploded across the grand lobby of Daniel Enterprises like a gunshot wrapped in velvet. Every conversation died mid-sentence. Champagne glasses froze halfway to lips. The string quartet's bows scraped to a halt on a discordant squeal. Jet Daniel stood at the top of the marble staircase, 35 years old and untouchable, winter steel eyes already fixed on his target. His midnight black tuxedo absorbed the light rather than reflected it, tailored so precisely it looked like a second, crueler skin. In his hand, a heavy crystal tumbler of 1926 Macallan caught the chandelier's glow and threw it back like a warning. He descended slowly, deliberately, each step a small execution. The crowd parted without thinking. They always did. Francis Hubbard had been mopping in slow, rhythmic circles near the 40-foot Norwegian spruce, humming under his breath the way he had every night for 12 years. Roshink's MIT mandolin. Raisins and almonds. The lullaby his wife used to sing to their unborn child in Krakow, 1944, when hope was still a thing people carried in their chests. The sound reached Jet like a blade sliding between ribs. He had not heard that melody since his mother died, since he found her curled on the bathroom floor with a hidden photograph clutched in her cold fingers. The photograph of a young man with gentle eyes and the number A14567 inked forever on his arm. Jet reached the old janitor in 6 strides. "Do you think this building is your personal synagogue, Hubbard?" His voice carried effortlessly, designed for boardrooms and courtrooms and public crucifixions. "Humming your little Hebrew dirges while the rest of us celebrate Christmas?" A nervous titter rippled through the executives closest to him. Someone coughed champagne. Francis stilled. The mop handle creaked in his swollen hands. "I'm sorry, Mr. Daniel. It won't happen again." "Sorry?" Jet's smile was beautiful and terrible. "You've been sorry for 12 years. 12 years I've allowed you to shuffle through my building like a relic nobody has the heart to throw away. 12 years I've let you stay late during my Christmas party out of the kindness I supposedly don't have." He kicked the mop bucket. It tipped with a metallic scream. Soapy water sheeted across the marble, soaking the hem of a senior VP's wife who shrieked theatrically. The puddle spread like blood. "On your knees, old man," Jet said softly. "Clean it up. Properly this time." Francis knelt. The sound of his knees hitting marble was loud in the sudden silence. He began mopping his own spill while the most powerful people in the city watched, some with phones already rising like periscopes. Elena Voss, Jet's executive assistant who had once seen him make a Fortune 500 CEO cry with 3 sentences, pushed through the crowd. She had been watching from the mezzanine and something in the old janitor's unnatural calm made her stomach knot. She had watched Jet destroy lives for sport. She had never seen anyone meet his gaze with the weary patience of a man who had already survived the worst thing imaginable. Francis reached for the overturned bucket. His sleeve rode up his thin forearm. The numbers appeared. A14567. Faded blue, scarred, impossible. The crystal tumbler slipped from Jet's suddenly numb fingers and shattered into 1,000 expensive pieces. The sound was deafening. His vision tunneled. The Christmas lights blurred into white-hot stars. He grabbed for the staircase railing as his legs buckled, the most powerful man in the city folding like paper. Because he knew those numbers. He had traced them with baby fingers on a photograph his mother kept hidden in her sitter. The only image she had of her first husband, the one who disappeared into Auschwitz when she was 6 months pregnant with their son. The husband who never came home. Francis straightened slowly, old bones creaking like a ship settling into port. His storm-gray eyes, gentle and ancient and heartbreakingly familiar, met Jet's for the first time in 77 years. "Hello, Jonathan," he said in the soft Yiddish cadence Jet had not heard since childhood. "You grew up so handsome, Motek. Just like I always knew you would." Jet hit the floor. Not dramatically. Not theatrically. Just collapsed. The way a man does when the ground vanishes beneath him. His $1,000 tuxedo pulled around him like spilled ink. "Dad?" The word came out small, cracked, the voice of a 5-year-old boy who used to wait every night by the window for a father who never returned from the camps. Francis knelt too, joints protesting, and wrapped his arms around the son he had not held since 1945. The navy jumpsuit smelled of pine cleaner and something older, something like home. "I survived, mankind," he whispered into Jet's perfectly styled hair. "I survived everything. Even losing you." Around them, the 40-foot tree kept twinkling. 10,000 lights reflected in the spilled water like fallen stars. Snow continued its silent fall beyond the revolving doors. And somewhere, in the stunned hush that had fallen over 500 of the city's elite, the string quartet began to play again. "Oh Holy Night." So softly it might have been the lullaby Francis had been humming all along. Jet Daniel, who had not cried since his mother's funeral, who had built an empire on the ashes of every soft thing inside him, sobbed like a child in the arms of the janitor he had just tried to destroy. The phones were out now. Videos already uploading. By morning, the world would know that the coldest man in the city had been brought to his knees by 7 faded numbers on an old man's arm. But in that moment, none of it mattered. There was only a father and a son, holding each other on a marble floor soaked with water and scotch and 80 years of unshed tears, while Christmas lights danced across the tattoo that proved miracles sometimes were jumpsuits and carry mops. And for the first time in his life, Jet Daniel, who owned everything, understood what it meant to be rich. The lobby remained frozen for 3 full heartbeats after Jet hit the marble, as though the entire building had forgotten how to breathe.
Welcome to the Alpha Empire, where greatness is built. If this inspired you, please like, share, and subscribe, and become a true part of the empire. Don't forget, this is the #1 way that you can assist us. Don't forget the notification so you can always see more of us. Thanks. We love you.
Security guards stood rooted halfway across the floor, hands hovering over radios, unsure whether protocol still existed when the man who wrote the protocol was weeping in the arms of the night janitor. Phones were already up, red recording lights blinking like predatory eyes. Within 30 seconds the first clip hit the internal company Slack with the caption, "CEO on his knees for janitor, WTF is happening?" By the time the minute mark passed, it was on X, on TikTok, on every group chat from here to Singapore. Harold Lang, Jet's CFO of 15 years, pushed through the circle of stunned executives, face the color of spoiled milk. "All right, everyone back to the party," he barked, voice cracking. "This is a private matter. Phones down. Now." Nobody moved. Nobody even pretended to obey. Francis Hubbard simply tightened his thin arms around the shaking man in the ruined tuxedo and looked up at the nearest guard, a former Marine named Torres who had once taken a bullet for Jet in Dubai. "It's all right, Kinder," Francis said quietly, the Yiddish word for child slipping out like a prayer. "He's my son. Let him breathe." Torres's hand fell away from his radio as though it had burned him. The other guards followed suit. Whatever hierarchy had ruled this building for decades had just been quietly dismantled by a 78-year-old man in a navy jumpsuit. Jet's voice came out small and raw, the voice of the 5-year-old who used to fall asleep clutching his mother's sleeve. "Dad," he whispered again, as if saying it louder might make the apparition vanish. "Dad?" Francis cupped the back of his son's head with a hand that trembled from arthritis and decades of holding back. "Yes, Motek. It's me. I'm here now." Harold tried again, closer this time, sweat shining on his upper lip. "Sir, we need to get you upstairs. The press is already gathering outside. We can contain." Jet lifted one shaking hand without looking up. The gesture was weak, but it carried the same absolute authority that had once closed 9-figure deals with a flick of 2 fingers. Harold's mouth snapped shut. Francis shifted his weight, knees creaking loudly in the silence, and began to stand. He was not a large man, had never been, but there was iron in what was left of him. He brought Jet up with him, slowly, steadily, until the most powerful man in the city was leaning on the janitor who had cleaned his toilets for 12 years. Come, Francis murmured, the same tone he had once used to soothe fevered children in the barracks of Auschwitz when the guards weren't looking. Not here. Not in front of them. He guided Jet through the parted sea of tuxedos and gowns, past the spruce still dripping with crystal icicles, past the shattered glass glittering like frost on the marble. No one dared speak. A woman near the champagne fountain began crying softly for reasons she could not have explained. They reached the private elevator tucked behind the tree. Francis pressed the button with the same hand that still bore the number that had just ended Jet's carefully constructed world. The door slid open with a whisper. They stepped inside alone. The ascent was silent except for Jet's ragged breathing and the soft mechanical hum. Mirrors lined every wall, merciless. Jet saw himself from every angle, eyes red and swollen, mouth trembling, tears cutting tracks through the city's most expensive skincare regimen, his head resting against the chest of a man in a janitor's jumpsuit whose name tag still read F. Hubbard. He made a sound like a wounded animal and slid down the mirrored wall until he was sitting on the carpeted floor of his own private elevator. Francis sat beside him without hesitation, back against the mirror, knees drawn up like an old man on a park bench. The elevator continued its smooth climb to the penthouse. 80 floors. 80 years. When the doors finally opened onto the private office, the city lay spread beneath them like a galaxy made of snow and light. The storm had thickened, flakes swirled against the glass in frantic patterns, as though trying to get inside to witness whatever came next. Francis helped Jet to the leather sofa that overlooked the vista. Jet collapsed into it, still clutching his father's sleeve as though Francis might dissolve if he let go. The office was dark except for the tree in the corner, smaller than the one downstairs but no less extravagant, its white lights reflecting in the windows until it looked as though stars were falling upward. Jet's voice cracked the silence. Why didn't you come find us? Francis sat on the edge of the coffee table, facing him. The city's glow painted silver in the thinning hair, in the lines carved deep around his eyes. I did find you, Yonatan. His Yiddish accent wrapped around the Hebrew name like a talus. August 14, 1947. I stood across the street from the hospital in Brooklyn and watched your mother carry you out in a blue blanket. You were screaming your lungs out. She was laughing and crying at the same time. I had not seen her smile since Krakow. Jet's breath hitched. Then why? Because I came straight from hell, my boy. Francis's voice stayed soft, almost conversational, the way survivors learn to speak of unspeakable things. I had blood on my hands that would never wash off. Things I did to stay alive. Things I did so others could live one more day. Your mother was pure. You were pure. I was poison. If I touched you, I would ruin you both. He reached out and laid his palm against Jet's wet cheek. The hand was calloused from years of mops and buckets, but it trembled. I chose to love you from a distance. It was the only clean thing I had left to give. Jet turned his face into that palm like a child seeking comfort after a nightmare. I waited for you, he whispered. Every night. I used to sit on the windowsill until Mom carried me to bed. I was sure you'd come walking up the street one day. Francis closed his eyes. A single tear tracked down the groove beside his nose and disappeared into the collar of the jumpsuit. I know, Motek. I watched you do it. Many times. Silence stretched between them, thick and sacred. Outside, the snow kept falling, erasing the city one layer at a time. Jet's voice came smaller than before. Stay tonight. Please. Just, stay. Francis looked at him for a long moment, eyes shining with everything he had never been allowed to say. Then he nodded once. I'm not going anywhere this time, Yonatan. He slipped off his worn shoes, placed them neatly side by side, and lay down on the sofa beside his son, the way he had once imagined doing when the child was small enough to fit in the crook of his arm. Jet curled into him without thinking, head on the janitor's chest, listening to a heartbeat he had believed stopped in 1945. Francis began to hum, so softly it was barely sound at all. Ross Hinks MIT mandolin. Raisins and almonds. And for the first time in 80 years, the lullaby finally reached the child it had been written for. The lullaby trailed off into the hush of falling snow against glass, leaving only the sound of two men breathing in a room that had never known silence like this. Jed had fallen asleep with his head on his father's chest, the way he had never been allowed to do as a child. Exhaustion had claimed him completely, the kind that comes after a lifetime of walls finally crumbles. Francis sat very still, one hand stroking his son's hair with the same rhythm he had once used to rock imaginary cradles in the dark. "Sleep, little one," he thought. "Let me carry the weight tonight." And in the quiet, the years folded back like pages in a book no one had dared open for 80 winters. Krakow, September 1944. The cattle car door rolled open with a scream of rusted metal, and light, real light, not the suffocating dark they had lived in for 3 days, poured in like judgment. Fischl Huberwitz was 28 years old, a typesetter with ink still under his fingernails from the underground press he had run with his brother-in-law until the Gestapo came. His wife Miriam, 6 months pregnant, her belly just beginning to swell under the threadbare coat he had wrapped around her, clung to his arm as they stumbled out onto the ramp at Birkenau. The air stank of burning hair and something sweeter, more terrible. SS officers shouted in German too fast to follow, dogs snarled, whips cracked. Families were torn apart with mechanical efficiency. An officer with a gloved hand and eyes like winter glass pointed left, right, right. Fischl felt Miriam's fingers slip from his as the crowd surged. "No," he started, but a rifle butt caught him between the shoulder blades and drove him forward. He turned in time to see the officer's glove flick toward the left. Miriam's face, pale, serene, already saying goodbye, disappeared into the tide of women and children moving toward the birch trees that gave the place its name. He never saw her again. They shaved his head with dull blades that took skin with hair. They stripped him naked in front of strangers. They hosed him with ice water that felt like knives. Then came the table. A man with a tattooing pen, drunk or bored or both, grabbed Fischl's left forearm and drove the needle in without ceremony. A 14567. The pain was sharp, intimate, permanent. The numbers bled. Someone poured iodine that burned worse than the needle. Fischl stared at the fresh ink and understood, with a clarity that would never leave him, that he was no longer a man. He was a unit. A thing to be counted, used, discarded. Block 11. Then Block 7. Then the Canada Commando, sorting the mountains of luggage stripped from new arrivals. Shoes. Suitcases. Children's toys. Eyeglasses piled like fish scales. He learned to move through the mounds like a ghost, pocketing what might keep someone alive another day, a crust of bread, a child's sweater, a photograph slipped into a boot. In Canada he found Miriam's coat. The blue one he had bought her the winter before the war, when they still believed in winters that ended. It lay in a pile waiting to be searched, one button missing, a dark stain near the hem that might have been blood or might have been anything. He pressed it to his face and inhaled, searching for her scent beneath the smoke and despair. There was nothing left of her in it. Only the weight of what had been taken. That night he sewed her wedding photograph, tiny, the size of a matchbox, into the lining of his cheek with a stolen needle and thread made from unraveled uniform. The stitches pulled at the inside of his mouth for weeks. He tasted blood every time he spoke, but the picture stayed hidden. It was the only part of her the Germans never touched. In October they made him Sonderkommando. They marched the new ones past the crematorium ovens still warm from the last transport. The coppa with the green triangle explained the job in a bored voice: undress the dead, cut hair, pull gold teeth, drag bodies to the ovens, sweep ash. Do it well and live another day. Refuse and join the next load. Fischl learned to move through hell with his soul folded very small and hidden in the same place as Miriam's photograph. He learned which guards looked away when an extra crust of bread disappeared into a striped sleeve. He learned the rhythm of the ovens, the way the smoke changed color when children burned. He learned to recognize the sound a skull makes when it explodes from heat. He learned to pray without moving his lips, without closing his eyes, because God, if God was still watching, would understand that survival was its own kind of prayer. In January 1945 the SS began evacuating. They marched the Sonderkommando out last, after dynamiting the crematoria to hide their crimes. Fischel walked west through snow that came up to his knees, wearing shoes made from tire rubber and rags. The guards shot anyone who fell. The road was lined with frozen bodies like mile markers. He walked for 3 days with Miriam's photograph still sewn in his cheek, tasting blood and snow and the metallic tang of hope dying. On the third night he collapsed in a ditch with hundreds of others. The guards had fled or frozen. He woke to silence and the sound of distant artillery. Soviet artillery. Liberation came on January 27, 1945, in the form of soldiers who looked at the walking skeletons and wept without shame. Fischel weighed 79 pounds. They carried him to a field hospital where he lay under a blanket that smelled of mothballs and mercy. Typhoid came next, burning him from the inside out. In his fever he saw Miriam walking toward him through the snow, belly round with their child, calling his name. When the fever broke, the photograph in his cheek had dissolved into pulp. He picked the pieces from his teeth like communion. DP camps. Endless forms. Endless waiting. He learned that Miriam had been on a transport to Stutthof, then somehow to Sweden via the white buses. Rumors said America. Rumors said dead. Rumors were the only currency left. In summer 1945 he walked back to Krakow because walking was all he knew how to do. The apartment on Josepha Street was occupied by strangers who looked at him with pity and fear. The woman who lived here, the new tenant said. Gone west. They said she was pregnant. They said America. America. The word tasted like salvation and punishment. He followed the Bricha route south, through Romania, Hungary, Austria. He crossed mountains with forged papers and a heart that had learned to beat very quietly. In Italy he nearly died of dysentery in a monastery cellar. In France he was shot at by border guards and left for dead in a ditch. In Belgium he traded his wedding ring, the one Miriam had slipped on his finger in 1939, for passage on a refugee ship. Each time he almost died, he touched the place inside his cheek where her photograph had once hidden and kept moving. The ship to New York was a rusting hulk that smelled of vomit and hope. They sailed in steerage, packed so tight you could not fall down if you fainted. When the Statue of Liberty appeared through the fog, Fischel Huberwitz stood on deck with nothing but the striped uniform he had burned years ago still tattooed on his soul and a number on his arm that would never fade. He gave the immigration officer a new name. Francis Hubbard. It sounded American. Safe. Forgettable. He stepped onto American soil in 1947 with $23 sewn into his coat lining, a tattoo hidden under a long sleeve, and a heart that had learned to love from a distance because it no longer trusted itself up close. He did not know yet that his son had been born 3 months earlier, screaming his lungs out in a Brooklyn hospital while his mother laughed and cried and named him Yonatan. He only knew that somewhere in this vast new country, Miriam was waiting. Or buried. Either way, he would find her. And if the price of seeing her again was watching from across the street, never touching, never speaking, never letting the darkness he carried anywhere near the light she had somehow preserved, then he would pay it. He had already paid worse. In the penthouse high above the sleeping city, Francis looked down at the man sleeping on his chest, his son, grown tall and hard and beautiful despite everything, and pressed a kiss to the dark hair that smelled of expensive shampoo and unshed tears. Sleep, Yonatan. Your father kept walking through hell so you would never have to. The snow kept falling, covering the city in forgiveness it did not deserve, and Francis Hubbard began, very quietly, to plan how a ghost might learn to live again. The kiss lingered on Jet's hair like a blessing Francis had waited 80 years to give. Outside the penthouse windows, the snow had begun to slow, each flake drifting down as though reluctant to disturb the fragile peace inside. Francis eased himself from beneath his son's weight, careful not to wake him. Jet stirred anyway, murmuring something in his sleep that sounded like mama, and curled tighter into the sofa cushions. Francis pulled a cashmere throw over him, the kind of blanket that cost more than most people made in a month, and stood looking down at the man his baby had become. So tall. So broken in ways the world could not see. He walked to the window and pressed his forehead to the cold glass. The city below was quiet now, streets empty, lights dimmed. Somewhere down there, in the years between his arrival and this impossible night, he had walked every one of those streets searching for traces of the life he was never meant to have. New York, August 1947. The ship docked at Pier 90 on a morning so hot the air shimmered above the Hudson. Francis stepped onto the gangplank with nothing but the clothes on his back, a donated shirt 2 sizes too large, trousers held up with rope, and the number on his arm hidden beneath a long sleeve despite the heat. He had $23 and a name that no longer fit his mouth. The city swallowed him whole. He slept in synagogues when they let him, in flophouses when they did not. He learned English from newspapers he fished out of trash cans, practicing the words under his breath while scrubbing floors in delis that paid him in scraps and suspicion. His accent was thick, his eyes too old for his face. People looked away. In September he found work cleaning offices in Midtown, nights only, because daylight still felt like a luxury he had not earned. He moved through the buildings like smoke, erasing the mess of other men's lives while carrying his own in silence. It took 4 months to find her. A cousin of a cousin, someone who had come over before the war, recognized the name Humiliates when Francis finally dared to ask. Miriam? Yes, she's here. Married again. A good man, accountant, lives in Brooklyn. Had a baby this year. A boy. The words hit him harder than any guard's rifle but ever had. He took the subway to Flatbush on a Sunday in August 1948, wearing his one good shirt, the one without patches. He stood across the street from the small brick house with the blue shutters and watched. The bris was held in the backyard because the house was too small for all the relatives. He saw her first. Miriam. Thinner than he remembered, hair cut short in the American style, but still with the same tilt of the head when she laughed. She wore a yellow dress that made her look like sunlight. In her arms was a baby wrapped in white, screaming his little lungs out as the mohel did his work. Francis stood behind a sycamore tree, hands clenched so tight his nails drew blood. The baby's cry cut through him like shrapnel. When the mohel lifted the child and pronounced the name, Yonatan, son of Miriam and David Cohen, something inside Francis broke open and spilled out onto the sidewalk. He felt it leave him, the last piece of the man who had once believed he could come home. Miriam kissed the baby's forehead. The new husband, tall, kind-faced, with wire-rimmed glasses, put an arm around her shoulders. They looked complete. Francis turned away before anyone could see him crying. He understood then, with perfect, brutal clarity. The man who had dragged bodies to ovens, who had pried gold teeth from mouths still warm, who had whispered Shema into the ears of dying children while the world burned, that man had no right to touch this new life. He would love his son the only way he still could. From a distance. He disappeared into the city that same day. Francis Hubbard became permanent. Fischl Humiliates was buried somewhere between the ship and the sycamore tree, buried deeper than any grave. He took night jobs exclusively. Cleaning offices, schools, hospitals. Places where no one looked too closely at the quiet man with the accent and the long sleeves even in summer. He learned to move through the world like a shadow, present but never seen. He followed his son the way other men follow sports teams or stocks. A notice in the synagogue bulletin about Yonatan's pity on Haben. A photo in the yeshiva newsletter, first day of school, age 6, gap-toothed smile and eyes that were Miriam's exact shade of gray. Francis kept every scrap in a shoebox under his bed. He was there for the bar mitzvah, standing at the back of the shul in a rented suit 2 sizes too big, watching his son read from the Torah with a voice that had not yet learned to be ashamed of trembling. Miriam cried through the whole thing. The accountant husband, David, put an arm around her and looked proud in the way only stepfathers who try very hard can. Francis left before the Kiddush. He was there when Miriam got sick. Cancer. Fast. Merciless. He sat in the hospital waiting room in his janitor's uniform, pretending to mop floors that were already clean, listening to the nurses talk about the beautiful woman in 4B who was fading too young. He watched through the glass as Jonathan, 22 now, tall and angry and terrified, held his mother's hand while she slipped away. Francis aged 10 years in that corridor. He was at the funeral too, standing far back under a tree, rain soaking through his thin coat. Jonathan, Jet now, the name change legal and final, stood by the grave with shoulders that had learned to carry the world too early. He did not cry. Not once. Francis cried enough for both of them. Years became decades. He watched his son build an empire out of grief and fury and a kind of intelligence that cuts like glass. Watched him become the man who owned buildings, who made other men flinch with a look, who never smiled in photographs. Francis cleaned them all. Every office tower Jet bought, Francis found a way to be assigned to the night shift. He learned the rhythms of his son's life by the trash he left behind, coffee cups with lipstick that was never the same twice, crumpled deal memos worth millions, notes in a handwriting that still looked like Miriam's when he was tired. He was there the day Jet acquired Daniel Enterprises. The listing went up at 3:17 p.m. By 3:42 p.m. Francis was at the maintenance office downtown, filling out an application with hands that had not shaken this badly since the ramp at Birkenau. He got the job. 12 years of mopping the same floors his son walked. 12 years of emptying wastebaskets that sometimes held photographs of women who would never know they were being discarded. 12 years of humming Roshink's MIT Mandolin when no one was listening, because some habits are older than survival. He watched Jet age into the man he was tonight, beautiful and cold and achingly alone. And every Christmas Eve, when the building emptied and the decorations went up, Francis stayed late. Because the lights reminded him of the Hanukkah candles they never got to light together. Because the quiet let him pretend, for a few hours, that the little boy waiting by the window might still be waiting. He never imagined the boy would come looking for him. In the penthouse, dawn was beginning to pale the sky over the East River. Francis turned from the window and looked at his son, still sleeping the exhausted sleep of a man who had finally been found. He had spent a lifetime being a ghost. Tonight, for the first time, he let himself wonder what it might feel like to be flesh and blood again. The city woke slowly below them, unaware that one of its tallest towers now held the most fragile miracle it had ever known. Francis sat down in the armchair across from the sofa and waited for his son to open his eyes. He had waited this long. He could wait a little longer. Francis did not move from the armchair as the first pale blade of winter sunrise cut across the penthouse carpet. He simply watched the man on the sofa breathe in and out, the way he had watched him breathe in a Brooklyn hospital incubator through a nursery window he was never allowed to enter. Jet stirred at the light. His lashes lifted slowly, storm-gray eyes exactly like his mother's, exactly like the eyes that had looked into gas chamber doors and still found a way to pray. For a moment he looked 5 years old again, lost and searching. Then memory crashed back in, and the CEO mask tried to slide into place. It cracked before it could settle. Francis said nothing. He only opened his arms. Jet crossed the room in 3 unsteady strides and folded himself into them like a man returning to a home he had forgotten existed. His face pressed against the worn navy jumpsuit that still smelled faintly of pine cleaner and the lobby downstairs. Francis held him the way he had never been allowed to hold him as a baby, one hand cradling the back of his son's head, the other pressed between shoulder blades that had carried the weight of empires built on grief. And in the quiet, while the city woke up to headlines it could never have predicted, the years peeled away again. This time, they peeled back to the boy who had learned to survive by never needing anyone. Brooklyn, 1980. I am 6 years old and I know my father is dead. Everyone says it kindly. The rabbi at Hebrew school. The neighbors who bring kugel after Shiva. My stepfather David, who tries so hard his voice cracks when he says, "Your Abba was a hero." But I know because of the chair. There is always an empty chair at our Seder table. Mom sets a place for Elijah and another one beside it that no one sits in. She lights the Yarzite candle every year on a date she never tells me, just cries quietly in the kitchen while the flame burns down. I sit on the windowsill every night until she carries me to bed, waiting for a man in a striped uniform to walk up the street with a number on his arm and miracles in his pockets. He never comes. Mom keeps one photograph hidden in her sitter. I find it when I am 8. A young man with gentle eyes and a small smile, standing next to Mom when she was round with me. On the back, in her handwriting, Fischl, Krakow 1939. His left sleeve is rolled up just enough to show the edge of the number. I trace it with my finger until the paper wears thin. When I am 10, the kids at school call me Nazi killer's son because my father died fighting them. I beat one of them bloody behind the synagogue and get expelled for a week. Mom cries harder than when the candle burns. I learn that softness gets you killed. I learn that waiting gets you nothing. When I am 12, David tries to teach me about stocks. I make my first $1,000 flipping baseball cards before bat mitzvah money even hits my account. By 14, I am running a small trading ring out of the school library. By 16, I have paid for Mom's experimental treatment with profits from options I taught myself on a library computer. Harvard comes calling with a full ride. Mom dies 3 weeks before graduation. I am 22. I stand at her grave in the rain and realize the empty chair is permanent now. There will never be anyone to fill it. The photograph is in my pocket, soaked through. The number bleeds ink onto my fingers like an accusation. I decide the world will never take anything from me again. I build walls out of money and steel and silence. First million at 25. A hostile takeover of a company that once rejected Mom's insurance claim. First billion at 31. The day the headlines call me the coldest bastard on Wall Street, I frame the article and hang it in my office. I learn to smile without warmth. I learn to make men twice my age flinch with a glance. I learn to sleep 4 hours a night and consider it a luxury. I buy buildings taller than God's reach. I collect art that costs more than countries. I date women who look good in photographs and leave before morning because morning is when the empty chair is loudest. I never go to Auschwitz. I tell myself it is because I am too busy. The truth is I am terrified the ground there will open and swallow me whole, that I will finally have to feel what I have spent my life out running. I never light a Yarzite candle for the father I never knew. The dates are wrong anyway. Mom never knew exactly when he died. The only soft thing I allow myself is the lullaby. Roz Hink's MIT mandolin. I play it on the piano in the penthouse when no one is there, fingers stumbling over keys because Mom taught me when I was 5 and I never let anyone teach me again. I hum it in the shower where no one can hear. I let it live in the locked room of my chest where nothing else is allowed. Until tonight. Until an old janitor with swollen knuckles and gentle eyes hummed it while mopping my lobby and something inside me detonated. I became the thing I hated most. Cruel. Small. The kind of man who kicks over buckets and makes old men kneel. Because for one terrifying second, hearing that song from a stranger's lips, I thought maybe the empty chair was not empty after all. And I could not bear it. In the penthouse, Jet pulled back just far enough to look at his father's face. Really look. The lines around the eyes. The mouth that had learned to smile without teeth because teeth were the first thing they knocked out in the camps. The hands that trembled slightly from arthritis and from holding back a lifetime of touch. I waited for you, Jet said, voice raw from crying and from truths he had never spoken aloud. Every night. Until Mom died. Then I stopped waiting and started building things so tall no one could ever leave me up there alone. Francis cupped his son's face in both hands, thumbs brushing away tears that had no business falling from eyes that had forgotten how. I know, mankind. I watched you build. Every floor you added was another brick in the wall around your heart. I cleaned them all. I was proud and heartbroken in the same breath. Jet laughed, a broken sound that turned into a sob. I became exactly what they would have wanted. Hard. Cold. Untouchable. No, Francis said fiercely. You became strong. There is a difference. Strength is what keeps the world out when it is trying to kill you. Hard is what happens when you forget how to let it back in. He pressed his forehead to Jet's. I am here now, Jonathan. The wall served its purpose. Let it crack a little. Let me in. Jet closed his eyes. The lullaby rose between them, not hummed this time, but remembered in the space where their heartbeats began to find the same rhythm. Outside, the sun climbed higher, gilding the snow-covered city in merciless, beautiful light. Inside, a man who had owned everything finally learned what it felt like to be held by the one thing money could never buy. And for the first time since he was 5 years old, Jet Daniel was not afraid of the empty chair. Because it was filled. The embrace lingered long after the sun had fully risen, bathing the penthouse in a cold, clear light that made everything feel too sharp, too real. Jet pulled back first, searching his father's face for some sign that this was permanent, that the miracle would not evaporate with the morning. Francis smiled, small and tired and true. We have time now, Jonathan. All the time we were robbed of. Jet nodded, throat working. Then, practical as always, he stood and straightened his ruined tuxedo shirt. You're not going back to that basement apartment. Not ever. The guest suite is yours. I'll have everything moved today. Francis opened his mouth to protest, but Jet was already on the phone, voice shifting back to the clipped command that ran empires. Appearances cancelled. Meetings postponed indefinitely. The world would wait. Christmas week began like that, suspended in a snow globe no one dared shake. Francis moved into the guest suite with nothing but a small duffel bag containing 2 changes of clothes, a worn sitter, and a pair of tefillin that had survived more than most men ever would. Jet watched him unpack in silence, feeling like a stranger in his own home. The penthouse was too large for 2 people who had spent a lifetime being alone. Mornings were the hardest. Jet woke to the soft murmur of prayer from the living room overlooking the park. He would stand in the hallway, barefoot on heated marble, and watch his father wrapped in a talus that had once been white but was now the color of old bone. Francis swayed gently, tefillin straps wound around his arm and forehead, the number A14567 stark against pale skin as he kissed the mezuzah he had affixed to the doorframe with tape because Jet had no idea where to buy one. Jet felt like an intruder witnessing something sacred he had no right to see. He would retreat to the kitchen and make coffee that was too strong, waiting for the prayer to end. When Francis emerged, eyes bright with a peace Jet could not understand, they would sit at the counter and eat in silence broken only by the clink of spoons against bowls. Francis cooked. Simple things. Potato kugel that filled the penthouse with smells Jet had forgotten existed. Chicken soup with carrots cut into stars because your mother used to do that for you when you were little, even though you don't remember. Jet ate every bite and felt like he was stealing. He tried to give his father things. A black Amex with no limit. A brownstone in Brooklyn Heights. A tailor who could make suits that fit a body that had never known anything but hand-me-downs. Francis refused everything with the same gentle firmness. A hot meal and a corner to Davin, he said, patting Jet's hand. That is all I ever wanted. The rest is noise. Jet did not understand. He paced the penthouse like a caged thing, phone buzzing endlessly with calls he ignored. The videos had hit 200 million views in 48 hours. #JanitorDad was trending worldwide. Memes of Jet on his knees. Think pieces about toxic masculinity and redemption. Offers for book deals, movie rights, exclusive interviews. He wanted to scream it from every screen, my father is alive. My father survived hell. My father is here. He tried on the 3rd night. They were eating kugel by candlelight because Francis insisted on Shabbat even when it was only Tuesday, because every day we have now is holy. Jet set down his fork. I'm calling a press conference tomorrow. We tell the world everything. Who you are. What you survived. We make sure no one ever forgets. Francis went very still. No. The word was soft but absolute. Jet stared. What do you mean, no? This is history. You're a miracle. People need to know. I said no. Francis's voice sharpened for the first time, an edge Jet had never heard. The world must not know Fischl Huberwitz still breathes. Jet laughed, incredulous. You're afraid of reporters? I own the reporters. I'll protect you. Francis stood, old bones creaking, and walked to the window. The city glittered below them like a promise it had never kept. You think the danger died with Hitler? He asked quietly. There are still those who would finish what was started. Men who collect our tattoos like trophies. Men who pay money to see the last of us die. I have lived this long by being forgotten. I will not trade my son's peace for fame. Jet rose too, anger rising like bile. You hid for 70 years. You let Mom die believing you were ash. You let me grow up with an empty chair at every table. And now you want to hide again? Francis turned. His eyes were wet but steady. I hid so you could live free. So you would never have to look over your shoulder for the rest of your life. Fame is a spotlight, Yonatan. And some shadows only grow longer when you shine light on them. They stood facing each other across the expanse of Italian marble, two survivors of different wars, neither willing to yield. Jet broke first. He turned away, fists clenched. Get out, then. If you want to be a ghost, go be one somewhere else. The words left his mouth before he could stop them. Francis did not flinch. He simply picked up his duffel bag from where it still sat by the door, the one he had never fully unpacked. As you wish, he said softly. He was at the elevator when Jet's voice cracked. Wait. Francis paused. I'm sorry, Jet whispered. Don't go. Please. I can't. I can't lose you again. Francis set the bag down. He crossed the room and pulled his son into his arms once more. Oil and water, Jet thought dimly. That's what we are. He clings to shadows. I want to burn the world down with light. But they held on anyway. Downstairs, in boardrooms that had once trembled at Jet's name, the vultures began to circle. Harold Lang convened an emergency meeting on the fourth day. 12 executives around the polished table, faces grim. He's gone off the deep end, Harold said, sliding printouts of the viral videos across the table. 200 million views. Stocks down 8%. Clients pulling out. He's moved the janitor into the penthouse. The janitor, for God's sake. Murmurs of agreement. We vote no confidence, someone said. Temporary leave of absence for mental health. We run things until he's stable. Harold nodded. He's not the Jet we know. That man on his knees? That wasn't our CEO. That was a breakdown. They voted unanimously. Upstairs, Jet sat on the sofa with his father's head on his shoulder, watching the snow fall and feeling the first real terror he had known in years. Not of losing money. Of losing the one person who had ever filled the empty chair. And outside, the city kept spinning its wheels in the snow, unaware that the most powerful man in it was learning, slowly and painfully, that some things could not be bought, commanded, or controlled. Only earned. One careful, trembling heartbeat at a time. The embrace after the fight felt like a truce written on ice, thin, temporary, and already cracking under the weight of everything unsaid. Jet held his father tighter than necessary, as though sheer force could fuse 80 lost years into something solid. Francis led him, patting his back with the same patient rhythm he had once used to calm terrified boys in the barracks when the world was ending one selection at a time. They separated slowly, warily, like two men who had just discovered the ground between them was mined. Jet poured coffee neither of them drank. Francis returned to the window, watching the snow finally taper off into weak gray daylight. The city below looked hungover, streets slushed and dirty, headlines already screaming across every screen. Victor Kane wasted no time. By noon on the fifth day, Kane Media Network led with it, a primetime special titled The Tattoo Hoax, How Jet Daniel Fell for History's Oldest Con. Victor Kane himself sat beneath studio lights that made his tan look radioactive, smiling the shark smile that had built his empire on outrage and denial. He held up a blown-up still from the viral video, the moment Frances's sleeve rode up. "Look at this," he said, voice dripping pity. "Blurry numbers. Conveniently faded. And this so-called janitor just happens to have the exact backstory to melt the Ice King's heart? Come on. It's elder abuse wrapped in a feel-good story. Daniel's lost it, folks. Or he's the one running the grift. He brought on experts, fringe historians who made their living questioning gas chambers, tattoo authenticity, the usual venom. They zoomed in on pixels, claimed the numbering sequence was wrong, the skin scarring inconsistent. Called Frances a crisis actor. A fraud preying on a billionaire's guilt. The Charon crawled beneath. Is Jet Daniels' miracle dad a lie? Jet watched it on mute in the penthouse media room, face carved from stone. Frances stood behind him, hands clasped, expression unreadable. By evening, the death threats started. Security intercepted the first wave, emails, calls, letters slipped under the lobby doors. Swastikas scrawled in red marker. Promises to finish what Hitler started. One envelope contained ashes and a note, "For the oven you escaped." Torres, the head of security, brought them up personally, face grim. "We've tripled the team, sir. No one gets in the private elevator without retinal scan now. But it's getting ugly out there." Jet nodded, barely hearing. His phone had not stopped vibrating. Board members texting in all caps. Investors pulling funds. The stock dipped another 12%. Frances said nothing. He simply went to the guest suite and closed the door. On the 7th day, a plain manila envelope arrived via courier. No return address. Hand-delivered to the front desk with instructions for F. Hubbard. Frances opened it alone in the kitchen while Jet was on a call pretending everything was fine. Inside was a photograph. Black and white. Grainy. Taken in Auschwitz, 1945, just after liberation. A group of Sonderkommando survivors, emaciated, eyes hollow, standing in front of Crematorium 3. Frances, official then, was in the back row, arm raised in a half-wave, the number clear even in the poor quality. On the back, in red ink, "We know who you are. The world will too." Frances's hands shook so badly the photo fluttered to the floor. Jet found him there 20 minutes later, sitting at the counter with his head in his hands, the photograph face down beside a cold cup of tea. He picked it up. Turned it over. The room tilted. "Who sent this?" Frances's voice came out cracked and ancient. "Someone who was there. Or someone who collects ghosts." Jet's rage ignited like dry tinder. He was on the phone within seconds, voice the one that had once made conglomerates fold overnight. "Get me everything on Victor Kane. Every shell company. Every offshore account. Every skeleton he thinks is buried." Frances tried to protest. "Yonatan, no." But Jet was already moving, predator mode sliding over him like armor. The coup happened in a boardroom on the 85th floor of Kane Tower, 48 hours later. Jet walked in alone, no lawyers, no security. Just him in a black suit and eyes that had finally learned what real hate felt like. Victor Kane smirked from the head of the table. "Daniel. Come to beg? Offer still stands, sell me your company for pennies before the world sees you for the gullible fool you are." Jet laid a folder on the table. Inside, bank records showing Kane's network had funded Holocaust denial conferences in Europe. Emails coordinating the experts on his show. Photos of Kane at private dinners with men who wore tiny swastikas on their lapels like secret society pins. And the killer, recordings of Kane laughing in a hotel suite about how easy it was to trigger the Jew boy with daddy issues. The board went white. Jet did not raise his voice. "You attacked my father," he said quietly. "You called a man who carried children to ovens so they wouldn't wake up scared of fraud. You're done." By the end of the week, Kane Media was hemorrhaging advertisers. Stock plummeted. The board ousted Victor in a midnight vote. Jet bought the controlling shares for less than the price of his watch. Headlines screamed, "Daniel destroys rival in revenge takeover." Victor Kane vanished into a private jet and a bottle of something expensive, last seen ranting to paparazzi about conspiracies. Jet came home victorious. And shattered. He found Frances in the kitchen making lax, the smell of onions and oil filling the penthouse like a memory from before the world broke. Frances flipped one carefully, not looking up. "You didn't have to do that for me. I did it for both of us." Frances set the spatula down. His hands were steady now, but his eyes carried the weight of crematorium smoke. "There's something I need to tell you, Jonathan. Something I never told your mother. Something I've never told God on the good days when I still believed he listened." Jet sat. The victory high drained out of him like blood from a wound. Francis spoke to the sizzling pan, not to his son. "In the Sonderkommando, we did things. Unthinkable things. We cut hair. We pulled teeth. We dragged our own people we knew, cousins, neighbors, to the ovens because if we didn't, we joined them. I whispered Shima into ears that could no longer hear. I held babies while their mothers were told to undress. I lied to children about showers and games so they wouldn't scream." His voice never rose. It simply went flat, the way water goes flat before it freezes solid. "I lived because I became efficient at death. I learned which way to turn bodies so the gold fillings fell out easier. I traded bread for silence when someone recognized me. I survived by becoming the thing I hated most." He turned then, eyes wet but unflinching. "I am unforgivable, Jonathan. Even by God. Especially by God. That is why I stayed away. Not to protect you from danger. To protect you from me." Jet stared at the man who had just made lax with the same hands that had once. He stood so fast the stool clattered backward. "No." Francis flinched. "You don't get to decide that," Jet said, voice shaking. "You don't get to carry it alone anymore. You were 28. They gave you hell and told you to survive or die. You survived. That's not unforgivable. That's a miracle." Francis laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "A miracle with blood under its nails. Then let me help wash it off." They stood there in the kitchen that smelled of onions and oil and impossible forgiveness, two men trying to reconcile the monster history had forced one to become with the gentle father grating potatoes for his son's dinner. Outside, the city kept moving, headlines already chasing the next scandal. Inside, Jet Daniel, the man who had just destroyed an empire in a boardroom, knelt on the heated floor and laid his head in his father's lap like the child he had never been allowed to be. Francis's hand came down, trembling, and rested on the dark hair. Oil and water. Monster and miracle. They were learning, slowly, how to mix. Francis's hand rested on Jet's head, fingers threading through the dark hair with a gentleness that belied the weight of what had just been confessed. The lax cooled forgotten on the counter, the kitchen filling not with the smell of frying oil but with the heavy silence of truths too long buried. Jet stayed there on his knees, face pressed into his father's lap, until his legs cramped and his pride no longer mattered. Finally, Francis spoke, voice soft as the first snow of winter. "Hanukkah begins tomorrow night." Jet lifted his head, eyes red-rimmed but clear. "I haven't lit candles since Mom died." Francis nodded, as if he had known. "Then we light them together. All 8. One for every miracle we almost lost." Christmas week became Hanukkah week in the penthouse, the two holidays overlapping like lives that had run parallel for too long and were finally colliding. The first night, Francis unpacked a small brass menorah from his duffel bag, its branches bent from years of careful hiding. He placed it on the windowsill overlooking the park, where the city lights twinkled like distant stars. Jet stood beside him, hands in his pockets, feeling like a child reciting lines he had half forgotten. Francis lit the shamash, then the single candle on the far right. "Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe." His voice was steady, the ancient Hebrew rolling off his tongue like it had been waiting 80 years for this moment. Jet repeated the words after him, stumbling over the pronunciation, the sounds foreign in his mouth after decades of silence. They stood there until the wick burned low, watching the flame dance against the glass. The second night, Jet lit the shamash himself. His hand shook slightly, but Francis covered it with his own, steadying. 2 candles now, plus the shamash. The light grew. Francis told a story then, of Hanukkah in the barracks, stolen potato peels mixed with oil, a wick made from thread, 8 tiny flames hidden under a bunk while guards patrolled outside. Jet listened without flinching this time. By the 4th night, Jet knew the blessings by heart. 4 candles burned bright against the winter dark, casting shadows that looked like arms reaching out. Francis shared memories of Miriam lighting candles in their Krakow apartment, her belly round with their unborn child, singing songs that had survived even the camps. Jet touched the menorah branches, feeling the warmth of the metal. The 5th night, 6 flames. Jet asked about the baby Miriam carried, the one who became him. Francis smiled sadly. She named you Yonatan before I left. God has given. Even then, she believed in miracles. The 6th night, 7 candles. The penthouse glowed. The 7th night, Jet bought a new menorah, silver and heavy, engraved with their names. Francis touched it gently. This one will last. And then came the 8th night. December 25th, Christmas Day. The city below glittered with holiday excess, trees in every window, lights strung like veins across the skyline. But up here, in the quiet sanctuary of the penthouse, it was just the 2 of them and the weight of everything finally ready to be said. Francis placed the menorah on the grand piano, where the city spread out like a carpet of fallen stars. 8 candles waited, plus the shamash, their wicks straight and expectant. Jet lit them one by one, from right to left, his hand steady now. The blessings flowed from him without hesitation, Hebrew perfect, boy strong. When the last candle flickered to life, the room transformed. 9 flames burned in unison, casting golden halos on the walls, turning the sterile penthouse into a temple. Francis sank onto the piano bench, suddenly looking every one of his 80 years. Jet sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. There is one more thing, Francis said quietly. The last secret. The one I kept even from myself for too long. Jet turned, the candlelight reflecting in his eyes. Tell me. Francis stared at the flames. I came back for you both. In 1947. August 14th. I stood outside the window of your Brooklyn home, watching. Jet went still. I saw Miriam nursing you. You were tiny, red-faced, fists waving like you were already fighting the world. She was singing Roz Hink's MIT mandolin, the same song I hummed downstairs that night. Your eyes, my eyes, locked on her face like she was the entire universe. Francis's voice cracked, just once. I could have knocked. I could have stepped inside and become the father you deserved. But I saw myself reflected in the window glass, a ghost with hollow cheeks and haunted eyes. A man who had become death's apprentice to survive. My soul was poisoned, Yonatan. Rotten through. How could I poison you too? He turned then, tears carving clean paths down his weathered cheeks. I chose to walk away. So you would have a chance at innocence I could never give. The words landed like the final blow in a war Jet had not known he was still fighting. Something deep inside him shattered, not with a crack, but with a howl. Jet's face contorted. A sound ripped from his chest, raw and primal, the abandoned child's wail he had swallowed every night for 40 years. Not the controlled tears of boardrooms and broken deals, but the gut-wrenching sob of a boy who had waited by the window until his hands bled from pressing against the glass. Francis pulled him close, wrapping arms that had once dragged bodies now cradling the son they had saved. Jet wept into his father's shoulder, fists clutching the worn sweater like a lifeline. You should have come inside. I needed you. We needed you. I know, Francis whispered, rocking him gently. I know, Motek. Forgive me. The candles burned steadily, unmoved by the storm between the two men. When the sobs finally eased into shuddering breaths, Francis pulled back just enough to cup Jet's face. Listen to me. Every night I walked away was a night I died a little more. But you lived. You became strong. Beautiful. The man I always dreamed you would be. Jet shook his head, tears still falling. I became hard. Because of you. No, Francis said fiercely. Because of what they took. Now we take it back. He took Jet's hand and placed it over his heart. With full knowledge of the horror between us, he said. We choose each other anyway. Jet nodded, throat too tight for words. Francis closed his eyes. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Jet joined him, voice breaking but sure. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Father and son, survivor and heir, whispering the prayer that had kept them alive across oceans of time and ash. Outside, the snow began to fall again, harder than it had in decades, blanketing the city in a white mercy that muffled the world below. Up here, 9 candles burned toward their end, their light holding back the longest night. And for the first time, the empty chair was not just filled. It overflowed. The Shema hung in the air between them like the final note of a symphony no one wanted to end. Jet's voice cracked on the last word, but he held it anyway, letting the ancient declaration fill the space where 80 years of silence had lived. The candles burned low, wax pooling like tears on the silver branches. Outside, the snow fell in thick, relentless curtains, as though the sky itself was trying to bury the world in mercy. Francis squeezed his son's hand once more, then released it to wipe his own eyes. Enough crying for one lifetime, he said softly. Now we live. And they did. 1 year later. The penthouse was quieter now, sold to a tech billionaire who wanted the view more than the ghosts. Jet had moved into a townhouse in Brooklyn Heights, close enough to the river to hear the water at night, close enough to his father's new home to walk there when the ache became too much. Francis lived above the synagogue on Eastern Parkway, in a small apartment that smelled of old books and fresh challah. The walls were lined with photographs now, not hidden in prayer books, but framed and proud. Miriam on their wedding day. Baby Yonatan in a blue blanket. Jet at his Harvard graduation, scowling at the camera because smiling felt like weakness then. He spent every Shabbat and holiday with his son, walking the few blocks between their homes like a man crossing a bridge he had waited a lifetime to find. Jet had stepped down as CEO in the spring. The announcement made headlines for a week. Billionaire walks away at the height of his power, but the truth was simpler. He woke up one morning and realized he no longer wanted to own the world. He wanted to fix what was broken in it. The Hubbard Foundation launched in June, funded with half his fortune and every ounce of influence he had left. Holocaust education in schools. Support for aging survivors who still woke screaming. Research into hate before it became history. Francis cut the ribbon at the opening ceremony, wearing a new suit Jet had bought him, standing tall despite the cane. But the real healing came in Poland. They went in the fall, when the birch trees were turning gold. Jet had expected to feel rage at Auschwitz, or grief, or something cinematic and overwhelming. Instead, he felt nothing at first, just the weight of his father's hand in his as they walked the railway tracks where the selections had happened. Francis moved slowly, pointing out details only a survivor would know. Here was the ramp. There was the orchestra that played while people died. Over there, the Sonderkommando barracks. Jet listened, tears falling without permission. They stood at the end of the tracks where the crematoria had been dynamited, now just ruins overgrown with grass. Francis took out a small stone from his pocket, the kind Jews leave on graves. For Miriam, he said. She never got to come here. Jet added his own stone. Then they said Kaddish together, voices carrying across the empty fields where millions had perished. Yikadal v'yitkadash shme rabba. Francis's voice was steady, strong from a lifetime of whispering prayers in hell. Jet's broke on every word, but he finished. When it was over, Francis turned to his son. Now we go home, he said. And we live for them. Christmas Eve came again, 1 year to the day since the lobby had shattered. The company party was different now. Smaller. Held in the old auditorium instead of the grand lobby. No 40-foot tree dripping with crystal. Just a simple evergreen decorated with white lights and paper doves made by children from the Foundation's programs. The guests were not the elite anymore. Survivors. Their families. Teachers who used the Foundation's curriculum. Kids who had learned that history was not just dates but people. Francis arrived wearing the new suit Jet had bought him for the Foundation opening, navy wool, perfectly tailored, the Star of David pin now polished and proud on his lapel instead of hidden. Jet met him at the door, eyes shining. "You look like $1 million, Jet said. Francis smoothed the jacket self-consciously. "Feels strange. Wearing something that costs more than my old apartment." Jet laughed, the sound free and genuine in a way it had never been before. He led his father to the front of the room where a small stage had been set up. The quartet, the same one from that night, waited with instruments ready. Jet stepped to the microphone. "A year ago," he began, voice carrying easily through the hushed room, "I was the richest man in this building. I owned everything except what mattered." He turned to Francis. "Tonight, I want to introduce you to the man who taught me what real wealth looks like." He held out his hand. Francis took it, stepping up beside him. "This is my father," Jet said, voice cracking with pride. "Fischl Huberwitz. Survivor of Auschwitz. The bravest man I've ever known." The room erupted in applause that went on and on, people standing, tears streaming down faces that had known too much loss. Francis bowed his head, overwhelmed. When the applause finally faded, Jet nodded to the quartet. They began to play. Roshink's MIT mandolin. Arranged as a violin solo, the melody soaring pure and heartbreaking through the room. Francis's eyes filled. Jet's did too. Together, they lit the menorah, 8 candles plus the shamash, flames bright and steady. Then Jet lit one more candle, simple white, in a holder beside Miriam's photograph. "For Mom," he whispered. Francis touched the flame with a trembling finger. "For all of them." They stood there.